The dense and unforgiving jungle of Phuoc Tuy Province in South Vietnam was a landscape that swallowed armies whole. By early February of 1966, the air was perpetually thick with oppressive humidity and the constant threat of unseen violence. From their recently established base at Nui Dat, the Australian Special Air Service Regiment looked out at a terrifyingly green ocean of vegetation. They understood that surviving this brutal environment required a complete departure from conventional military thinking. The jungle was not merely a physical obstacle to be bulldozed, it was an intricate living entity that demanded absolute respect and quiet mastery. The American military command approach during this period was defined by massive firepower and overwhelming logistical superiority. General William Westmoreland's strategy relied heavily on large unit operations, deploying entire companies and battalions on sweeping search and destroy missions across suspected enemy territories. The metric for success was the body count, operating on the flawed assumption that attrition alone could break an ideological insurgency. American forces moved through the dense foliage with heavy equipment, making enough noise to alert any Viet Cong unit within miles. They searched frantically for an elusive enemy solely to obliterate them immediately with devastating, indiscriminate force. In stark contrast, the Australians brought a peculiar and highly effective doctrine forged in the brutal campaigns of the Malayan Emergency and the Borneo Confrontation. They deployed a total force of merely 4,500 men, an impossibly small number compared to the sprawling American divisions. However, they insisted on operating entirely independently within their own tactical area of responsibility. They championed what they termed the find, fix, and strike doctrine. This methodology dictated that soldiers must meticulously track the enemy to understand their infrastructure and supply lines first, rather than rushing blindly into chaotic and costly immediate engagements. The fundamental philosophy of the Australian forces prioritized intelligence gathering over immediate tactical destruction. "We weren't interested in body counts," explained Major Brian Wade, a seasoned commander who oversaw numerous classified Special Air Service operations throughout 1966. "We wanted to know where the enemy lived, how they moved, where they got their supplies. You can't kill an organization by shooting individual soldiers. You kill it by destroying its infrastructure." This disciplined approach required an extraordinary level of patience that American commanders initially viewed as a quaint, slow, and ultimately ineffective method of waging modern, high-intensity jungle warfare. To execute this demanding doctrine, the Australian military relied upon the elite Special Air Service Regiment. Formed in 1957 and heavily modeled after their legendary British counterparts, these unique soldiers underwent a selection process of unfathomable brutality. The training courses lasted for 6 exhausting months, intentionally designed to push human endurance to its absolute breaking point. Candidates were forced to navigate treacherous jungle terrain for weeks, with minimal rations and sleep. The psychological and physical toll was so immense that a staggering 80% of all eager volunteers ultimately failed to meet the regiment's impossibly high operational standards. Those exceptional few who successfully passed the agonizing selection phase entered a new realm of specialized warfare education. They mastered advanced tracking techniques, learning to identify individual enemy soldiers by analyzing microscopic details in footprints and disturbed vegetation. They practiced silent killing methods and advanced survival skills that allowed them to sustain themselves without external logistical support. Most crucially, they cultivated profound patience. They were trained to remain absolutely motionless and perfectly concealed mere meters away from passing enemy patrols for hours on end, suppressing every natural human instinct to flee or aggressively engage a vastly numerically superior foe. The structural foundation of this lethal capability was the revolutionary 5-man patrol unit. While American infantry squads typically deployed with 10 to 12 men to ensure sufficient firepower, the Australians calculated a different tactical equilibrium. They determined that 5 operators constituted the optimal balance for deep jungle infiltration. This precise number was small enough to maintain perfect stealth and avoid enemy detection, yet sufficiently armed to survive a brief, violent contact if compromised. It provided the ultimate tactical flexibility required for close-quarters tracking, allowing the team to move through the suffocating vegetation like silent, lethal phantoms hunting their prey. Every single member within this tight-knit five-man configuration possessed highly specialized and indispensable skills. The patrol commander was responsible for all tactical decisions, navigation, and mission planning under extreme pressure. A dedicated medic carried specialized trauma supplies explicitly designed to sustain the isolated patrol for an entire week without any hope of aerial resupply or medical evacuation. The signaling specialist maintained critical encrypted communications with the command base, a lifeline that proved absolutely vital when the patrol operated 20 kilometers deep inside hostile territory. Every man depended entirely on the flawless execution of his brother's specific operational duties. At the very front of this phantom formation walked the two scouts, invariably the most experienced and perceptive soldiers in the regiment. These men possessed an almost supernatural ability to read the jungle environment, as if it were a printed language. They understood that freshly broken branches signaled recent enemy movement, while disturbed leaf litter could indicate the exact number of passing fighters and their marching speed. The faint, lingering smell of cooking fires or cheap tobacco revealed hidden enemy encampments long before visual contact was made. They were the essential sensory organs of the entire hunting party. The equipment carried by these elite operators thoroughly reflected their underlying tactical philosophy of supreme stealth and precision. They aggressively stripped away anything that rattled, clinked, or reflected sunlight, securing every loose item with thick layers of tape. While standard American infantrymen confidently carried automatic rifles capable of firing hundreds of rounds per minute, the Australian patrols utilized heavily modified, suppressed weapons. These specialized rifles reduced the deafening crack of a gunshot to a barely audible whisper in the dense foliage. They operated under a strict doctrine of firing single, obsessively aimed shots only when absolutely necessary for survival. This reliance on precision over volume was a matter of life and death for the isolated teams. "You don't spray and pray when you're outnumbered 50-1, noted Corporal Peter Doc Kelly, a highly respected patrol medic who understood the grim mathematics of jungle warfare. Every single shot has to count, and every single shot has to be completely silent. They carried no heavy machine guns, no bulky rocket launchers, and absolutely no fragmentation grenades, as the explosive noise would instantly compromise their hidden positions and draw the wrath of entire enemy battalions down upon their fragile perimeter. By the middle of February 1966, this uniquely trained squadron had already conducted several preliminary reconnaissance patrols in the immediate vicinity of their fortified camp at Nui Dat. These initial, highly cautious missions formally established the rigid operational protocols that would define their entire combat deployment. They enforced absolute noise discipline at all times, relying exclusively on complex hand signals for communication. Nobody spoke a single word once they crossed the wire into the hostile green perimeter. They cultivated an atmosphere of supreme patience, understanding that any momentary lapse in concentration would undoubtedly lead to a swift and brutal death. The true test of their revolutionary doctrine arrived when military intelligence reported a massive Viet Cong force operating stealthily near the treacherous Hat Deech corridor. This specific geographical area was a highly notorious and heavily utilized enemy infiltration route that had previously frustrated Allied commands. American forces had repeatedly swept through this exact region with overwhelming battalion-strength operations, generating massive amounts of noise and destruction, only to find absolutely nothing before finally withdrawing in frustration. The elusive enemy fighters had simply melted away into the shadows, waiting patiently for the heavily armed foreigners to abandon the fruitless, exhausting search. Faced with this persistent strategic failure, the Australian command decided it was time to deploy their highly specialized tracking methodology. Instead of sending another massive, noisy formation to blindly sweep the empty jungle, they proposed an audaciously simple alternative. They would insert a single, isolated five-man patrol into the hostile zone with one clear directive: track the vast enemy force for as long as humanly possible, regardless of where the grueling pursuit led or how many treacherous days it consumed. It was a mission profile that seemed deliberately designed to ensure the total annihilation of the small reconnaissance team. On the damp morning of the 20th of February 1966, At precisely 0600 hours, Sergeant Bob Paddy Condon's elite patrol was abruptly inserted by a lone transport helicopter into a tiny jungle clearing. This insertion point was located a terrifying 8 kilometers from the suspected enemy concentration. Within mere minutes of the aircraft's roaring departure, the 5 heavily camouflaged Australians had completely vanished into the oppressive, dark undergrowth. They immediately transitioned into their standard staggered formation, moving deliberately in a single file line with exactly 10 meters of spacing between each operator to minimize the devastating impact of any sudden ambush. Every single step they took through the dense primary forest was carefully calculated and executed with agonizing precision. The operators deliberately placed the outer edges of their boots on the damp jungle floor first, slowly rolling their weight inward to avoid snapping hidden dry twigs or aggressively rustling the thick surrounding vegetation. The stifling morning heat quickly soaked their uniforms in sweat, but they maintained their excruciatingly slow, silent pace. They existed in a state of hypervigilance, constantly scanning the dark green shadows for tripwires, hidden sentries, or the slightest unnatural disturbance in the chaotic natural geometry of the jungle. By mid-morning, the silent hunters finally discovered their initial quarry. They stumbled upon a distinctly beaten footpath carved deeply into the forest floor, a trail clearly worn down by hundreds of rapidly moving, sandaled feet. The physical evidence was incredibly fresh, so recent that Sergeant Condon could clearly observe tiny pools of water where the soft mud had not yet dried inside the deeper footprint impressions. The sheer volume of tracks indicated a massive tactical movement that far exceeded any standard local guerrilla patrol. The jungle itself seemed to hold its breath in the wake of the passing army. The experienced patrol commander immediately understood the terrifying scale of the adversary they were now hunting. "We counted boot prints for 20 solid minutes," Condon recalled years later, his voice still tinged with the awe of that dangerous morning. "We saw dozens of different tread patterns and drastically different shoe sizes stamped into the earth. This wasn't just a standard fighting platoon moving through the sector. This was a full, heavily armed enemy battalion actively on the move. The 5 isolated Australians were now directly trailing a seasoned combat force that possessed enough firepower to instantly vaporize their small team. Despite the overwhelming mathematical disadvantage, the patrol began to follow the massive footprint highway. However, they possessed the tactical wisdom to never walk directly upon the beaten trail itself, knowing that such an amateur maneuver was tantamount to immediate suicide. Instead, they moved parallel to the main path, navigating through adjacent patches of jungle so incredibly thick and tangled that they sometimes managed to cover merely 500 meters in a grueling hour. This agonizingly slow parallel tracking allowed them to monitor the enemy's general direction of travel while simultaneously remaining completely hidden behind a dense, impenetrable wall of green. This terrifying, methodical pursuit represented the ultimate physical manifestation of their radical military doctrine. They were willingly transforming themselves into ghosts, stalking a leviathan through its own dark, familiar territory. Every passing minute increased the horrific probability of an accidental discovery, yet they pushed deeper into the hostile void without hesitation. They completely lacked heavy air support, had absolutely no artillery batteries on standby, and possessed no quick reaction force waiting to violently extract them if this deadly game of hide-and-seek suddenly went wrong. They relied purely on their unparalleled stealth, their silent weapons, and their iron discipline. Lead Scout Bob "Smoky" Dawson took the point position, his eyes constantly scanning the unbroken wall of green that lay before them. He was not merely walking, he was reading the intricate language of the dense jungle environment with every agonizingly slow step. The deep infiltration routes of the treacherous Hat Ditch corridor were notoriously unforgiving, punishing even the slightest lapse in concentration with immediate, violent death. Dawson understood that the lives of his 4 team members depended entirely upon his unparalleled ability to detect hidden dangers before they could react. The physical and psychological toll of maintaining this extreme level of stealth was virtually incomprehensible to conventional infantry units. Moving through the dense primary forest parallel to the heavily beaten enemy trail required the Australian operators to contort their bodies through incredibly tight, tangled vines. They had to ensure that their weapons, carefully taped and secured, never scraped against the abrasive bark of the ancient mahogany trees. Sweat poured down their camouflaged faces, stinging their eyes, but nobody dared to raise a hand to wipe it away, lest the sudden movement draw attention. Dawson paused, raising a single clenched fist into the humid air, instantly freezing the entire five-man patrol in their tracks. It was exactly 1400 hours on that fateful afternoon, and the dense jungle had finally yielded a terrifying revelation through a small gap in the suffocating foliage. Less than 15 meters ahead of their concealed position, a massive Viet Cong rest area sprawled across a small, shaded clearing. The sheer scale of the enemy presence was staggering, confirming their worst fears about the size of the force they were currently stalking. Between 30 to 40 hardened enemy soldiers were casually scattered throughout the perimeter, a mere fraction of the 300-strong battalion they had been silently tracking. The Australian operators instantly melted into the rotting undergrowth, becoming entirely indistinguishable from the damp earth and shadows. From this terrifyingly close vantage point, they could clearly observe the enemy fighters lounging comfortably in suspended hammocks, meticulously cleaning their battered automatic weapons and quietly cooking small rations of rice. The faint, metallic clicking of rifle bolts being tested seemed deafening in the otherwise silent jungle. The patrol remained perfectly motionless in their precarious hiding spots for 3 agonizing hours, their muscles cramping in protest against the forced immobility. They were so incredibly close to the resting enemy force that they could easily hear the casual, low-pitched conversations floating through the humid air. Sergeant Condon mentally cataloged every crucial detail he observed, making careful note of specific unit insignia displayed on the soldiers' uniforms and the various types of weaponry scattered around the temporary encampment. This intelligence was precisely what they had risked their lives to gather. As the late afternoon shadows began to lengthen and dusk rapidly approached, a sharp command suddenly echoed across the crowded clearing. The resting Viet Cong force immediately sprang into organized action, efficiently packing their minimal equipment and reassembling into a disciplined marching column. Within minutes, the vast enemy formation began moving steadily northward, deeper into the dark, uncharted heart of their own heavily fortified territory. Condon signaled his men with a subtle flick of his wrist, and the phantom patrol silently rose from the jungle floor to resume their deadly pursuit. Tracking an enemy force of this magnitude during daylight hours was incredibly dangerous, but night tracking elevated the risk to an almost suicidal level. It is widely considered among the most difficult and psychologically demanding military skills ever conceived by modern special operations forces. When the sun finally dipped below the dense canopy, plunging the jungle into absolute, suffocating darkness, the Australians were stripped of their primary sense. They could not risk using flashlights or any form of artificial illumination, as even the faintest glimmer would instantly betray their compromised position. Moving efficiently through the pitch-black jungle required an excruciatingly slow pace and an almost supernatural reliance on their remaining heightened senses. Every single operator strained their ears to maintain contact with the enemy column ahead, without accidentally revealing their own fragile presence. The elite Special Air Service soldiers had trained endlessly for exactly this terrifying scenario in Australia's harshest, most unforgiving terrain. However, absolutely no amount of rigorous training could ever fully prepare a human mind for the reality of stalking hundreds of heavily armed guerrilla fighters through a blind, hostile void. "You followed by sound mostly," Dawson explained years later, perfectly capturing the surreal terror of that completely blind, nocturnal pursuit. "You listened intently for the rhythmic clink of heavy equipment, the muffled voices of officers calling out to each other in the dark, and the distinct, lingering smell of cheap cigarettes drifting back along the trail. Sometimes you actually got so incredibly close in the darkness that you felt like you could just reach out your hand and physically touch the very last man marching in their long, winding column. The inherent danger of the situation was magnified by the absolute trust each operator had to place in the man walking directly behind him. If the point man suddenly stopped, the rest of the patrol had to sense the halt immediately to avoid a disastrous, noisy collision in the dark. At precisely 2300 hours, the relentless marching of the massive Viet Cong force finally ceased, and the unmistakable sounds of a large, entrenched nighttime camp being rapidly established echoed through the dense, surrounding trees. The grueling pursuit had paused, Kondan cautiously guided his exhausted team to a carefully selected observation position located exactly 100 meters away from the bustling enemy perimeter. This specific distance was calculated with mathematical precision. It was close enough to effectively observe the enemy's activities, but just far enough away to reasonably avoid accidental detection by wandering sentries. The patrol silently settled into the damp leaf litter, preparing for an incredibly tense night surrounded by hostile forces. They meticulously established their own microscopic defensive perimeter, ensuring every angle of approach was covered by a suppressed weapon. Sleep was an impossible luxury in this terrifying environment, so the team strictly adhered to a rigorous schedule of 2-hour watch rotations. While one man stared intently into the oppressive darkness, his finger resting lightly against the trigger of his rifle, the others lay motionless, attempting to rest their burning muscles. Nobody slept deeply, their minds constantly racing with the horrific knowledge that at any given moment, a wandering Viet Cong sentry could easily stumble right into their hidden position. The tension hung in the air, thick and suffocating like the humidity. At exactly 0300 hours, the darkest and most psychologically draining part of the night, Corporal Tim Fisher was pulling his mandatory watch. The jungle was eerily quiet, save for the constant, maddening hum of insects, when Fisher suddenly heard the terrifying sound of footsteps approaching his exact position. A lone Viet Cong soldier, likely seeking a private spot to relieve himself, was walking directly toward the concealed Australian medic. Fisher's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird, but his rigorous training completely overrode his natural, human panic. The enemy combatant casually strolled within 3 meters of where Fisher lay, perfectly melded into the shadows of the dark undergrowth. The Australian operator never moved a single muscle, barely allowing himself to draw a shallow breath as the armed man stopped just feet away. The enemy soldier casually urinated against a nearby tree, entirely oblivious to the lethal, suppressed rifle barrel pointed directly at his chest through the dense brush. After what felt like an absolute eternity, the man finally turned around and ambled casually back toward the main encampment. Fisher slowly exhaled a silent breath of profound relief, the immense adrenaline dump leaving his limbs feeling heavy and completely drained of energy. The Viet Cong soldier never knew exactly how incredibly close he had just come to a sudden, silent death in the dark jungle. This terrifyingly intimate encounter perfectly summarized the extreme peril of their unprecedented mission. They were swimming completely unnoticed in a vast, dark ocean entirely filled with aggressive, heavily armed predators. One tiny mistake, one snapped twig, or one heavy breath would result in their immediate slaughter. As the first faint gray light of dawn finally began to pierce through the thick canopy on the morning of February 23rd, the patrol faced a critical decision. The military intelligence officers back at the Nui Dat base desperately wanted the exact coordinates of the permanent Viet Cong base camp for a massive, devastating airstrike. However, the deeply entrenched enemy force was now located incredibly far inside their own heavily fortified territory, likely marching directly toward their primary, fortified headquarters. Following them any further meant walking into an absolute death trap. Continuing this relentless pursuit meant deliberately advancing into a highly restricted area where hundreds, perhaps thousands, of additional enemy fighters actively operated on a daily basis. The logical, conventional military choice would be to immediately break contact, slowly retreat to a secure extraction zone, and call in the valuable intelligence they had already gathered. But Sergeant Kondan, evaluating the immense strategic value of completely mapping the enemy's hidden infrastructure, made the incredibly bold and dangerous call. The 5 Phantom operators would absolutely continue their silent, deadly hunt deeper into the abyss. The vast Viet Cong battalion began rapidly mobilizing at the very crack of dawn, their harsh voices echoing through the misty morning air as they prepared to march. Kondan's isolated patrol instantly mirrored their movements, maintaining their agonizingly slow, parallel tracking through the dense, wet vegetation. The surreal nature of their daring mission became even more apparent as the morning progressed, pushing the boundaries of human endurance. They were essentially a microscopic 5-man organism, stubbornly stalking a massive, heavily armed military leviathan directly through its own heavily fortified, undisputed backyard. With absolutely zero external support available, and their radio communications severely limited by the dense jungle canopy, the Australians were entirely on their own. If they were suddenly discovered by the enemy rear guard, they would undoubtedly be surrounded and violently killed in a matter of terrifying seconds. Yet, the unacceptable alternative of completely losing contact after enduring such extreme hardship and coming this incredibly far was entirely rejected by every man present. They swallowed their fear, gripped their suppressed weapons tightly, and stepped silently forward into the dangerous, unknown green shadows. They were rapidly approaching the absolute climax of their grueling 48-hour hunt, completely unaware that their precise actions over the next few hours would ultimately rewrite the tactical playbook. The Australian doctrine of immense patience and unparalleled stealth was currently being tested against the harshest possible realities of the vicious Vietnam conflict. The men moved like silent specters through the oppressive heat, their eyes locked on the faint signs of the enemy trail ahead, preparing themselves mentally for whatever violent horrors the deep jungle was about to violently unleash upon them. The dense, tangled primary forest slowly began to give way to a drastically different and far more terrifying type of terrain as the late morning approached. The closely packed ancient mahogany trees and the suffocating undergrowth gradually thinned out, revealing the perfectly straight, geometric rows of a massive, pre-war rubber plantation. This highly manicured landscape presented a terrifyingly unique tactical challenge for the 5 hidden operators. While the wide lanes between the scarred rubber trees provided significantly better visibility for tracking, they simultaneously stripped away the comforting, dense concealment of the deep jungle. Stepping out into this open, geometric environment felt completely unnatural and incredibly exposed after spending so many intense hours completely swallowed by the dense, dark brush. Every single operator acutely felt the invisible, burning gaze of potential enemy sentries as they carefully navigated between the tall, bleeding rubber trees. They were now actively stalking their massive prey across an eerie, highly structured battlefield, where any sudden movement could be easily spotted from hundreds of meters away. The deadly game of hide-and-seek had just entered its most vulnerable and completely terrifying phase. The transition from the chaotic, tangled undergrowth of the deep jungle into the highly structured environment of the massive rubber plantation drastically altered the tactical reality. It was exactly 1000 hours on the morning of February 23rd, and the glowing sun was already baking the damp earth beneath the towering, scarred trunks. This vast, geometric landscape presented an incredibly terrifying duality for the 5 Australian operators. The perfectly aligned rows of mature rubber trees offered significantly longer sightlines, allowing them to track the massive enemy column with far greater ease from a considerable distance. However, this sudden increase in visibility was a lethal, double-edged sword that cut both ways in the hostile territory. While the isolated Special Air Service Patrol could now clearly see the Viet Cong fighters maneuvering ahead, the enemy could just as easily spot the heavily camouflaged Australians. The comforting, thick green veil of the primary jungle had been entirely stripped away, leaving them feeling completely naked and terrifyingly exposed in the open lanes. Every single step taken across the decaying leaves covering the plantation floor felt like a monumental risk that could trigger their immediate slaughter. Sergeant Bob Paddy Condon cautiously guided his small team deeper into the expansive, shadowy corridors of the silent plantation. They moved with an agonizingly slow, fluid grace, deliberately utilizing the thick, bleeding trunks of the ancient rubber trees to mask their fragile silhouettes. The massive enemy formation they were hunting continued to march steadily forward, completely unaware of the 5 lethal phantoms trailing silently in their wake. The tension in the humid air was so incredibly thick that it felt almost tangible, a heavy physical weight pressing down relentlessly upon the shoulders of the exhausted men. Without any prior warning, the terrifyingly predictable rhythm of the massive enemy march was abruptly shattered. The vast Viet Cong column suddenly ground to a complete, unexpected halt, roughly 60 meters ahead of the Australian patrol's current position. A single, sharp command echoed sharply through the quiet rows of geometric trees, the urgent, guttural Vietnamese words slicing through the morning humidity like a razor. The casual, relaxed posture of the hundreds of resting guerrilla fighters instantly vanished, immediately replaced by a frantic, highly disciplined state of aggressive military readiness that chilled the watching operators. The sudden shift in the enemy's behavior indicated a massive, immediate threat to the hidden tracking team. The Viet Cong soldiers immediately began spreading out in a highly organized tactical formation, deliberately abandoning their linear marching column. They started moving deliberately outward, establishing a loose, sweeping search pattern that was moving completely perpendicular to their previous established route of travel. Someone near the rear of the enemy formation had either spotted a fleeting shadow, heard a snapped twig, or simply felt the primal, undeniable instinct that they were being quietly hunted by unseen predators. Kondan immediately recognized the immense danger of the unfolding situation and urgently signaled for an absolute, immediate halt. The 5 Australian soldiers instantly froze completely in place, desperately pressing their camouflaged bodies hard against the damp, rough bark of the nearest rubber trees. They essentially transformed themselves into motionless, living statues, desperately attempting to blend their outlines into the dark vertical shadows cast by the tall timber. 60 meters ahead, dozens of heavily armed enemy soldiers were actively sweeping through the open plantation, their dark eyes frantically scanning the surrounding vegetation for any unnatural disturbances. The horrifying geometry of the enemy's aggressive search pattern quickly became entirely apparent to the trapped Australian patrol. If the Viet Cong searchers simply continued moving in their current tactical direction, maintaining their organized, sweeping formation, they would inevitably walk directly past the exact trees where the operators were currently hiding. The massive, invisible mathematical net was rapidly closing around the tiny Special Air Service team, severely limiting their available options for survival. The suffocating reality of their dire situation settled over the men as they tightly gripped their suppressed rifles with sweating hands. In this desperate, terrifying moment, the highly trained elite soldiers possessed exactly 3 potential choices, and every single option seemed disastrous. The first option was to immediately break contact and frantically run back toward the dense jungle, which would guarantee immediate detection and a massive, fatal pursuit. The second option was to aggressively open fire with their suppressed weapons, a completely suicidal action against a vastly numerically superior force that would easily obliterate them in seconds. The third, and arguably most psychologically agonizing choice, was to simply remain completely frozen and desperately pray. Relying entirely upon their brutal, extensive training and their unwavering trust in each other, the isolated patrol collectively chose the third option. They committed to absolute, unwavering stillness, willingly handing their immediate fate over to the incredible effectiveness of their camouflage and their iron discipline. The sheer mental fortitude required to stand perfectly motionless while dozens of heavily armed, hostile soldiers actively hunted you was entirely incomprehensible. Every single natural, biological instinct screamed at the Australians to either aggressively fight for their lives or rapidly flee from the rapidly approaching, overwhelming danger. The ensuing 20 minutes would later be described by the surviving operators as an absolute, unending eternity of pure psychological terror. Slowly, methodically, the loose line of Viet Cong searchers pushed deeper into the specific sector of the sprawling rubber plantation where the phantom team was currently hiding. The audible crunch of dry leaves beneath enemy sandals grew steadily louder, a terrifying, rhythmic countdown to what seemed like an inevitable, violent discovery. The Australians meticulously slowed their breathing to a shallow, silent minimum, desperately willing their racing hearts to somehow stop pounding against their ribs. The enemy soldiers drifted dangerously close, passing within an astonishingly tight 20-meter radius of the completely frozen, heavily camouflaged Special Air Service patrol. The tense, urgent voices of the Viet Cong fighters, calling out specific tactical commands to one another, drifted clearly through the humid air. "Keep your weapons ready," one enemy officer sternly ordered in Vietnamese, his voice carrying easily across the short, open distance separating the hunters from the hunted. The Australians could clearly see the deep scratches on the wooden stocks of the enemy's automatic rifles as they swept the area. Lead Scout Bob Smokey Dawson found himself in the most terrifyingly exposed and completely vulnerable position of the entire halted patrol. Partially concealed behind a slightly narrower rubber tree, He was forced to remain absolutely motionless as a heavily armed enemy soldier walked directly toward his specific line of sight. The incredibly tense situation escalated to a nightmare when the Viet Cong fighter paused merely yards away and slowly turned his head. One of them looked right at me. Dawson would later describe the terrifying encounter. I thought for absolute certain he had finally seen me. For a single, agonizing heartbeat, time itself seemed to completely stop within the silent, deeply shadowed rows of the massive plantation. Dawson stared back at the searching enemy soldier, entirely unable to blink or even slightly shift his heavy gaze away from the imminent threat. He acutely felt the cold, heavy steel of his suppressed rifle pressed tightly against his chest, knowing that if the man raised his weapon, he would have to fire immediately. However, the miraculous effectiveness of the Australian camouflage perfectly disrupted his physical outline, completely confusing the searching human eye. The Viet Cong soldier's dark, searching eyes slid right over Dawson's frozen, camouflaged form, without registering any unnatural anomaly in the surrounding environment. Incredibly, the enemy fighter simply adjusted the heavy canvas strap of his rifle, turned his head back toward the primary search line, and just casually kept walking forward. Dawson did not allow himself to exhale or relax a single, tensed muscle, completely aware that the immediate danger was still incredibly present all around them. The extreme psychological discipline required to survive that singular, terrifying interaction was the absolute pinnacle of their training. Similar, silent, horrifying dramas were quietly unfolding across the incredibly tight perimeter maintained by the other 4 completely frozen patrol members. Corporal Peter Doc Kelly watched intensely as a group of 3 enemy soldiers passed so incredibly close that he could actually smell the pungent odor of fermented fish sauce clinging to their damp uniforms. Every single operator fought a massive, agonizing internal battle against the violent urge to aggressively twitch, loudly swallow, or nervously adjust their heavy equipment. They were entirely submerged in a terrifying state of sensory overload, relying purely on stoic endurance. The immense physical pain of maintaining this absolute, unnatural rigidity for such an extended period of time began to severely compound the intense psychological terror. Muscles began to aggressively cramp and painfully burn in profound protest, violently demanding any form of movement to relieve the building, unbearable lactic acid pressure. Yet, the isolated men pushed deeply through the excruciating physical agony, expertly utilizing complex mental dissociation techniques they had learned during their brutal selection process. They completely disconnected their terrified minds from their suffering bodies, essentially becoming completely inanimate, silent objects scattered throughout the woods. Slowly, the intense, immediate pressure of the aggressive, localized search pattern finally began to gradually dissipate within the sprawling rubber plantation. The Viet Cong soldiers, having thoroughly swept the immediate surrounding area and miraculously finding absolutely nothing amiss, began to casually lower their heavy weapons. The sharp, guttural commands echoing through the trees shifted from urgent, aggressive searching instructions to general orders to efficiently reform the primary marching column. The terrifying, invisible net that had nearly captured and destroyed the small Australian team was slowly being deliberately withdrawn by the massive, unsuspecting enemy command. Kondan watched with intense, cautious relief as the various enemy search elements slowly drifted back toward the deeply beaten central trail. The incredibly dangerous crisis had miraculously passed, entirely due to the patrol's unwavering execution of their radical, passive concealment doctrine. If they had panicked, if even a single operator had nervously fired a premature shot, they would currently be dead men bleeding out on the damp plantation floor. Instead, they had successfully endured the absolute ultimate test of their extreme stealth capabilities, proving that true invisibility was indeed entirely possible in the lethal jungle. It took several more agonizing minutes before the massive, 300-strong Viet Cong battalion was fully reassembled and ready to resume their march. The deep, rhythmic crunching of hundreds of heavily worn sandals hitting the dirt trail finally began to recede slowly into the distance. Sergeant Condon waited patiently until the enemy rearguard was completely out of visual range before finally lowering his own raised hand. Only then did the 5 exhausted, terrified Australian operators allow themselves to collectively release the massive, shuddering breath like they had been desperately holding for 20 agonizing minutes. The sheer adrenaline crash that immediately followed the passing of the terrifying enemy search element left the men feeling incredibly hollow and physically weak. Their tightly cramped muscles involuntarily trembled as they slowly, painfully peeled their heavily sweating bodies away from the rough bark of the sheltering rubber trees. They exchanged silent, incredibly intense glances with one another, acknowledging the profound, terrifying reality of how incredibly close they had just come to total annihilation. Without exchanging a single spoken word, they instantly understood that they had just successfully survived the most dangerous moment of their lives. However, the brutal, unrelenting reality of their incredibly dangerous mission immediately demanded their full, undivided operational attention once again. They had successfully avoided catastrophic detection, but the primary objective of entirely locating the permanent enemy base camp was still absolutely incomplete. The massive Viet Cong force was still actively moving forward, leading them even deeper into the darkest, most heavily fortified sectors of the hostile territory. Despite the immense, lingering psychological trauma of their recent near discovery, the 5 Phantom operators quietly reloaded their weapons, adjusted their heavy gear, and prepared to follow the enemy. This terrifying encounter within the geometric confines of the rubber plantation perfectly illustrated the absolute core philosophy of the Australian Special Air Service. They firmly believed that utilizing extreme patience was not merely a passive, secondary virtue, but rather a primary, active, and incredibly lethal weapon of war. While an American infantry patrol would have undoubtedly engaged the searching enemy force immediately, triggering a massive, chaotic, and ultimately fatal firefight, the Australians chose silent endurance. By bravely refusing to shoot first, they had successfully ensured their own survival and kept the critical intelligence mission entirely alive. By mid-afternoon on February 23rd, the deeply exhausted patrol had been actively tracking the massive enemy force for well over 30 grueling hours. They had successfully covered nearly 25 dangerous kilometers entirely on foot, constantly moving through highly hostile territory, completely devoid of any friendly military support. They were relentlessly stalking an overwhelming, heavily armed force that still had absolutely no idea they were actively being hunted by 5 invisible ghosts. The unprecedented success of this extreme infiltration was rapidly pushing the absolute limits of human endurance, tactical skill, and sheer, unbelievable combat luck. As the tall, bleeding rubber trees finally began to merge back into the suffocating, chaotic tangle of the dense primary jungle, the men pressed onward. Every single silent footstep taken brought them significantly closer to the hidden, strategic heart of the enemy's sprawling logistical infrastructure in the region. The terrifying 20 minutes spent frozen, completely solid against the rough bark, had forever changed them, burning a permanent, chilling lesson about survival into their minds. They had completely mastered the deadly art of becoming absolute nothingness, and that profound emptiness was about to ultimately destroy the enemy. The 5 exhausted Australian operators pushed deeply into the rapidly thickening jungle canopy, leaving the terrifyingly exposed geometric rows of the massive rubber plantation far behind them. They had been actively tracking the massive enemy force for over 30 agonizing hours, covering nearly 25 grueling kilometers through deeply hostile territory. The oppressive heat and suffocating humidity drained their physical reserves, but their sharp mental focus remained incredibly absolute. Every single silent footstep taken brought them significantly closer to uncovering the hidden, strategic heart of the enemy's sprawling logistical infrastructure in the Phuoc Tuy province. As the late afternoon shadows finally began to stretch across the dense primary forest, the winding enemy trail abruptly descended into a massive, heavily concealed natural valley. The Australian patrol cautiously moved forward, carefully utilizing the dense vegetation along the steep ridge to completely mask their slow approach. Sergeant Bob Paddy Condon signaled his exhausted men to halt just below the military crest of the towering ridgeline. Through the thick, tangled vines and giant tropical leaves, they finally laid eyes upon the massive, hidden objective that Allied military intelligence desperately needed to locate and destroy. The sprawling Viet Cong base camp sat perfectly nestled within the deep, protective bowl of the heavily forested valley, remaining entirely invisible from any passing Allied aircraft. This was absolutely not a hastily constructed temporary encampment utilized by transient guerrilla fighters moving through the harsh combat sector. It was a massive, highly sophisticated military infrastructure featuring deeply entrenched fighting positions, heavily fortified subterranean storage bunkers, and a large headquarters complex. The 5 Phantom operators quietly marveled at the sheer scale of the impressive enemy installation, instantly recognizing the immense strategic value of their unprecedented discovery. From their secure observation position, located exactly 200 meters away on the elevated ridge, the patrol meticulously counted the numerous enemy structures scattered throughout the valley. Hundreds of heavily armed Viet Cong soldiers moved confidently throughout the sprawling camp, feeling completely secure within their own heavily defended, uncharted sanctuary. The heavily camouflaged Australians remained perfectly motionless in the damp undergrowth, functioning as silent, invisible witnesses to the massive enemy gathering. They were completely surrounded by hostile forces, yet they possessed the ultimate tactical advantage of total, uninterrupted surprise over the completely unsuspecting enemy battalion below. The critical responsibility of relaying this incredibly valuable intelligence back to the Allied military command now rested entirely upon the capable shoulders of signaller John Sparks Henderson. Slowly and deliberately, Henderson carefully unspooled his heavy, encrypted radio antenna, expertly weaving the thin communication wire through the dense lower branches of a nearby mahogany tree. He double-checked his map coordinates with absolute, mathematical precision, acutely aware that a single minor calculation error could potentially bring friendly artillery fire raining down upon their own concealed position. The entire grueling 48-hour tracking mission culminated in this single, vital radio transmission. Nui Dat Command. This is Patrol Zero Alpha. We have visual confirmation of a battalion-sized enemy base camp at grid reference exact, Henderson whispered softly into the heavy radio handset. The encrypted transmission sliced invisibly through the thick jungle canopy, instantly bridging the massive 25-kilometer gap between the isolated 5-man patrol and the heavily fortified Australian command base. He quickly detailed the massive scale of the hidden enemy infrastructure, providing specific target coordinates for the heavy storage bunkers and the central headquarters complex. The deadly trap had been flawlessly set by the invisible phantoms of the jungle. A tense, heavy silence blanketed the elevated observation ridge as the 5 exhausted operators patiently awaited the massive, destructive culmination of their incredibly dangerous tracking operation. Sergeant Condon strictly ordered his men to carefully prepare their heavy equipment for an immediate, rapid tactical withdrawal the very moment the requested airstrike commenced. They knew the incoming, deafening explosions would instantly shatter their vital concealment, severely agitating the hundreds of surviving enemy soldiers in the valley below. The incredibly narrow window for their safe extraction would only remain open during the absolute peak of the violent, fiery chaos. High above the dense, unbroken green ocean of the Phuoc Tui jungle canopy, the faint, high-pitched whine of approaching jet engines rapidly began to build into a deafening roar. A flight of heavily armed American fighter bombers suddenly broke through the thick cloud cover, guided flawlessly toward the hidden valley by the precise mathematical coordinates provided by the isolated patrol. The Viet Cong soldiers in the sprawling camp below suddenly stopped their daily activities, aggressively pointing their weapons toward the sky in sheer, confused terror. The invisible Australian phantoms watched silently as the massive, destructive thunder finally arrived. The very first massive bomb violently impacted the precise center of the sprawling enemy headquarters complex, instantly vaporizing the heavy timber structures in a blinding, terrifying flash of pure white heat. A deafening physical shockwave violently ripped through the hidden valley, violently shaking the steep observation ridge where the 5 camouflaged Australian operators remained perfectly concealed. Massive plumes of thick, oily black smoke and pulverized orange dirt erupted violently into the humid sky as multiple fighter bombers initiated their devastating, consecutive attack runs. The previously tranquil, heavily fortified jungle sanctuary was instantly transformed into a chaotic, burning hellscape. Heavy secondary explosions continuously rocked the fiery valley as the deeply entrenched subterranean storage bunkers and massive hidden ammunition caches were systematically located and violently destroyed from above. The carefully constructed military infrastructure that had likely taken the enemy battalion several grueling months to efficiently establish was being systematically eradicated in a matter of terrifying, chaotic minutes. The sheer, overwhelming destructive power of the coordinated airstrike was an absolute testament to the incredible tactical value of precise, verified intelligence gathering. The isolated, five-man tracking team had successfully orchestrated a massive, decisive military victory without firing a shot. As the deafening roar of the heavy jet engines and the continuous, violent explosions completely drowned out all other sounds, Sergeant Condan immediately signaled for the tactical withdrawal. The five invisible operators instantly melted backward into the deep, dark shadows of the primary forest, utilizing the massive, chaotic distraction in the burning valley to mask their rapid departure. They moved with an incredible, fluid speed that sharply contrasted with their previous, agonizingly slow tracking pace, eager to completely sever contact with the agitated enemy force. The lethal, invisible phantoms were silently slipping away into the darkening jungle, navigating entirely by specialized magnetic compasses and their exceptional, highly honed survival instincts. The exhausted patrol rapidly pushed several kilometers away from the burning, chaotic target zone. They maintained strict, absolute noise discipline despite their incredibly rapid pace, acutely aware that surviving enemy patrols would soon be aggressively sweeping the surrounding jungle for any signs of Allied infantry. The thick, dark canopy slowly began to obscure the massive, towering columns of black smoke rising ominously from the completely destroyed Viet Cong base camp. They had successfully completed their impossible mission and were now focused entirely on their immediate survival. Shortly before nightfall, the tired Special Air Service Patrol successfully reached their designated, pre-planned helicopter extraction zone, located deep within a relatively secure sector of the province. A lone, heavily armed transport helicopter quickly descended into the small, dark jungle clearing, its massive rotor blades violently whipping the surrounding vegetation into a chaotic frenzy. The five heavily camouflaged men rapidly boarded the hovering aircraft, their faces completely black with dirt and their uniforms utterly soaked in sweat. As the helicopter steeply banked away toward Nui Dat, they finally allowed their exhausted, battered bodies to collapse against the vibrating bulkheads. Upon their safe return to the heavily fortified Australian military base, the incredibly detailed debriefing provided by Sergeant Condan's elite patrol sent massive shockwaves through the Allied command structure. Military intelligence officers meticulously analyzed the verified target coordinates and the subsequent, highly successful aerial damage assessment reports provided by the American bomber pilots. The devastating airstrike had successfully destroyed the majority of the enemy base camp infrastructure, violently killing an estimated 80 heavily armed Viet Cong fighters in the process. The massive, dangerous enemy battalion had been brutally forced to immediately abandon their hidden regional stronghold. American military commanders, who had previously dismissed the extremely patient Australian tracking doctrine as completely quaint and ineffective, suddenly began paying very close, serious attention to the astonishing results. The sheer, undeniable tactical efficiency of the operation completely shattered their deeply entrenched institutional reliance on deploying massive, noisy search and destroy battalions across the hostile terrain. Captain James Walker, the designated United States Army liaison attached to the Australian task force, was absolutely astounded by the incredibly detailed mission reports. He deeply struggled to completely comprehend how merely 5 isolated men had successfully achieved such a massive victory. "We honestly could not believe the final operational reports," admitted Captain Walker, shaking his head in sheer disbelief as he reviewed the highly classified Special Air Service documents. 5 guys quietly did exactly what we had been actively trying to accomplish, using massive, heavily armed, battalion-sized operations for over a year. They efficiently found the massive enemy force, tracked them completely undetected for miles, called in the precise coordinates, and got out totally clean. The profound realization that a fundamentally different, significantly more effective method of jungle warfare actually existed was a massive paradigm shift for the American officer. The most incredibly shocking statistic to the conventional military establishment was that this massive, destructive blow against the Viet Cong infrastructure had been achieved with absolutely zero friendly casualties. The deeply entrenched American military doctrine heavily accepted high numbers of Allied infantry casualties as an entirely unavoidable, necessary cost of conducting aggressive combat operations against a massive enemy force. However, the elite Australian patrol had successfully inflicted horrific damage upon the massive enemy battalion without shedding a single drop of their own blood. It was a completely revolutionary application of precise military force wrapped in absolute stealth. The immense psychological impact of achieving total, uninterrupted tactical surprise over a vastly numerically superior enemy force could simply not be accurately measured by standard military body counts. The surviving Viet Cong soldiers essentially believed they had been violently struck by invisible, vengeful ghosts who could seamlessly navigate the deepest, darkest parts of the dense jungle. They possessed absolutely no idea how their heavily fortified, deeply hidden sanctuary had been accurately located and completely destroyed without any prior warning or localized infantry contact. This lingering, deep-seated paranoia severely fractured their operational confidence and deeply disrupted their regional command structure. This incredibly successful 48-hour tracking operation completely solidified the truly lethal, almost mythological reputation of the Australian Special Air Service Regiment within the broader Vietnam conflict theater. They had unequivocally proven that their highly specialized doctrine of immense patience, absolute stealth, and precise intelligence gathering was fundamentally superior to blind, overwhelming conventional firepower. The incredibly tight-knit five-man patrols were no longer viewed as an eccentric, bizarre military experiment by their highly skeptical American allies stationed in the region. They were now widely recognized as the undisputed, absolute masters of the dark, incredibly dangerous primary jungle environment. As the intense, grueling months of early 1966 slowly progressed, the completely verified tactical success of Sergeant Condon's elite patrol fundamentally altered how Allied forces viewed the Phuoc Tui region. The massive Viet Cong battalions could no longer safely rely upon the deep, previously impenetrable jungle canopy to completely hide their sprawling, complex logistical networks from Allied intelligence officers. The incredibly terrifying realization that tiny, invisible teams of highly trained Australian killers were constantly stalking them deeply infected the broader enemy psychology. The dark, heavily forested sanctuary had suddenly been transformed into a highly dangerous, constantly monitored hunting ground. Encouraged by this massive operational triumph, the Australian Military Command quickly began authorizing significantly more deep infiltration missions directly into the most dangerous, highly contested enemy territories. The elite Special Air Service operators continuously refined their highly specialized tracking techniques, constantly adapting to the rapidly shifting, highly complex nature of the brutal counterinsurgency conflict. Every single successful patrol further proved that a highly trained, deeply disciplined team of 5 men could effectively paralyze entire enemy battalions through the terrifying threat of sudden discovery. The profound silence of the jungle had officially become the most terrifying weapon in their entire arsenal. It was directly during the immediate aftermath of this incredibly devastating airstrike that the heavily battered enemy forces began to cautiously whisper a brand new, terrified name. Captured Viet Cong documents and harshly interrogated enemy prisoners soon revealed that the invisible Australian operators were now formally referred to as the dreaded Phantoms of the Jungle. This dark, highly respectful moniker perfectly encapsulated the sheer, undeniable terror they actively inflicted upon an enemy force that previously believed they completely owned the dark woods. The elite tracking teams had successfully become the most deeply feared entities operating within the entire province. Select, highly specialized units within the broader United States Military Command eventually began desperately requesting dedicated training sessions with the legendary Australian Special Air Service veterans. They actively sought to closely replicate the incredibly successful 5-man patrol structure and aggressively adopt the highly effective, intelligence-driven tracking methodologies utilized so perfectly by their smaller allies. While completely transforming the massive, heavily conventional American military machine remained completely impossible. The absolute tactical brilliance of the Australian doctrine could no longer be entirely ignored. The Phantoms had successfully taught a massive, powerful army an incredibly vital lesson about precision warfare. The smoldering, utterly destroyed ruins of the massive Viet Cong base camp effectively served as a highly visible, incredibly violent monument to the absolute effectiveness of extreme patience. Sergeant Condon and his exhausted team had successfully achieved the absolute impossible, surviving a deeply terrifying 48-hour hunt to deliver a completely devastating, decisive blow against their numerical superiors. They had successfully weaponized the dense, chaotic jungle, turning the enemy's deepest, most secure sanctuary into a violent, burning tomb of twisted metal and pulverized earth. The Phantoms had violently delivered their thunder, and the entire course of the localized war had shifted. The resounding success of the initial tracking missions throughout early 1966 fundamentally transformed how the Australian Special Air Service operated within the Phuoc Tuy province. They aggressively refined their highly specialized techniques, continuously developing what rapidly became known among Allied forces as their devastating ambush tactics. After silently tracking a massive enemy force to their hidden base area, the elite five-man patrols would meticulously establish lethal claymore mine ambushes directly along the deeply beaten enemy supply routes. These carefully orchestrated ambushes were absolute masterclasses in the terrifying application of psychological warfare against a numerically superior foe. The sheer mechanical precision of these sudden attacks completely shattered the enemy's psychological resolve and operational confidence. We would violently hit them directly at dawn when they were still half asleep and highly vulnerable, explained Sergeant Jim Ridley, a seasoned veteran who successfully conducted over 40 dedicated ambush operations. We would carefully initiate 8 heavy claymore mines detonating completely simultaneously, which was immediately followed by exactly 30 seconds of incredibly precise, suppressed rifle fire, and then absolute silence. We would be completely gone before the surviving enemy forces could even effectively react to the massive, chaotic carnage. From the terrifying perspective of the surviving Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army forces operating in the province, they were being brutally slaughtered by invisible ghosts. They desperately attempted to aggressively adapt their tactical doctrine, although this localized adaptation proved incredibly difficult against an enemy they simply could not find. They drastically increased their standard patrol sizes to provide overlapping security, but the highly observant Australians simply avoided these larger formations and deliberately tracked the smaller, isolated logistical units. The deeply frustrated enemy commanders even desperately attempted to set complex counter-ambushes directly along the known tracking routes. However, the deeply experienced Special Air Service operators constantly studied these specific enemy adaptations and continuously altered their own unpredictable infiltration routes. The Viet Cong actively tried to aggressively track the Australian trackers, but the heavily camouflaged Phantoms were simply far better at the deadly art of deep jungle craft. We started discovering highly classified documents on dead enemy soldiers, specifically warning about our exact operations, proudly noted Major Brian Wade. They openly called us the Phantoms. They completely knew we were out there hiding, but they simply could not figure out how to effectively counter us. This profound psychological impact, generated by a few dozen men, was ultimately worth far more than any conventional military body count. Several elite American Special Operations units quickly began requesting dedicated Special Air Service assistance and actively adopted highly similar stealth techniques into their own specialized training regimens. However, attempting to seamlessly implement this highly patient, intelligence-focused doctrine across the entire conventional United States Army ultimately proved completely impossible. The meticulous Australian approach required incredibly extensive specialized training, extremely small unit sizes, and a total willingness to aggressively prioritize complex intelligence gathering over immediate, violent combat engagements. These fundamental tactical concepts fiercely conflicted with the deeply established American operational tempo and their incredibly rigid troop rotation policies. The most significant, highly effective adaptation, championed by the brilliant Australian commanders, was their absolute reliance on meticulously gathered, intelligence-driven targeting. Rather than continuously conducting completely random, incredibly noisy infantry sweeps across massive swaths of empty jungle, every single Special Air Service patrol possessed highly specific, thoroughly vetted intelligence objectives. They were explicitly deployed to identify a specific hidden supply cache, locate a newly constructed headquarters, or aggressively track one particular, highly dangerous enemy combat unit. Through these relentless, highly focused tracking operations, they successfully built a deeply comprehensive, heavily detailed intelligence picture of massive enemy operations. The localized military understanding they actively generated in Phuoc Tuy far exceeded what massive American conventional forces routinely achieved in almost any other province. We genuinely knew the deeply hidden enemy's daily routines far better than they actually did, boasted Lieutenant Ken Thompson, reflecting upon the incredible situational awareness his small units maintained. We explicitly knew exactly which hidden trails they utilized, exactly when they normally moved, and precisely where they securely camped at night. The invisible operators could easily predict major enemy troop movements simply because they had been silently watching them from the dark shadows for months. The exhausted Viet Cong forces aggressively responded with increasing, deeply crippling institutional paranoia that severely hindered their regional logistical capabilities. Highly classified internal enemy documents captured significantly later in the brutal war clearly showed that guerrilla units in Phuoc Tuy faced strict standing orders. They were explicitly commanded to entirely avoid specific geographical areas, never stay in one localized position for more than 2 consecutive nights, and maintain an impossibly heavy constant security. All of this incredibly disruptive, resource-draining enemy behavior was purely generated by the persistent threat of isolated Special Air Service operations. The measurable operational statistics generated between late 1967 and early 1968 were absolutely staggering to conventional military analysts. The deeply respected Australian squadron successfully conducted over 120 dedicated patrol days, completely submerged in highly hostile enemy territory. They aggressively engaged in over 60 sudden, violent combat contacts, while miraculously suffering remarkably few Allied casualties. They recorded exactly 3 brave men killed in action, compared to over 500 confirmed enemy deaths. These incredibly lethal small teams successfully achieved sustained enemy kill ratios that completely exceeded a staggering 100-to-1. They actively found significantly more hidden enemy base camps, buried supply caches, and deeply fortified subterranean headquarters complexes than several entire American infantry divisions combined. Thanks entirely to this profoundly effective doctrine, the Australian-controlled Phuoc Tuy province rapidly became one of the most incredibly secure administrative regions in all of South Vietnam. This profound regional security was absolutely not achieved through the blind application of overwhelming conventional force, but through relentless tracking and superior battlefield intelligence. We effectively made the Viet Cong heavily afraid to actively operate openly within our designated sector, accurately explained Warrant Officer Harry Williams. They deeply knew that if they moved during the day, we might be silently watching. If they camped at night, we might be instantly calling in heavy artillery coordinates. That sheer, unrelenting psychological fear was our absolute greatest weapon. Yet, entirely buried within this incredible narrative of localized tactical brilliance lay an incredibly profound, deeply tragic historical paradox. The meticulously executed Australian operational approach worked absolutely brilliantly, but it simply could not win the broader war. While the dense jungles of the Phuoc Tuy province were heavily secured, the sprawling nation of South Vietnam as a whole was fundamentally collapsing. The elite Special Air Service undeniably proved that highly patient, deeply intelligent, small unit combat operations could easily dominate a deeply entrenched insurgent enemy. However, the entire Australian military commitment only provided roughly 4,500 total combat troops to the massive, countrywide conflict. Attempting to effectively scale such highly specialized operations across the entire volatile nation would have absolutely required the massive American military to completely restructure their fundamental fighting doctrine. They would have needed to entirely abandon their deeply ingrained reliance on massive firepower and aggressively embrace the patient art of jungle tracking. We successfully showed them a vastly better, highly efficient way to fight, but they simply could not structurally implement it, correctly noted Colonel David Thompson, with a heavy hint of lingering professional frustration. The massive American military machine was explicitly built from the ground up for waging massive conventional warfare. They relied entirely on deploying huge divisions, massive army corps, and completely overwhelming aerial firepower that devastated the local landscape. You absolutely cannot just simply flip a sudden organizational switch and instantly turn that massive conventional behemoth into a delicate, small unit counterinsurgency force. The incredibly deep institutional inertia within the Allied command structure was simply too great to overcome. The massive, highly coordinated Tet Offensive that suddenly exploded across the entire country in January of 1968 perfectly reinforced this tragic, undeniable strategic paradox. Within the borders of Phuoc Tu province, the highly diligent Australian military intelligence apparatus had successfully tracked all major enemy logistical preparations for several tense weeks leading up to the attacks. When the massive enemy offensive finally commenced, the deeply entrenched Australian forces were completely prepared and violently defeated the localized uprising incredibly quickly. Conversely, across almost the entire remainder of the fractured country, the massive American conventional forces were caught completely by surprise by the sudden violence. The absolute tactical excellence painstakingly achieved within one isolated, heavily monitored province simply could not properly compensate for the massive, overarching strategic failure occurring across the broader nation. Furthermore, the specialized Australian military approach strictly required something that the heavily burdened American military command never possessed in sufficient quantities: time. The elite Special Air Service soldiers strictly trained for several grueling years in incredibly harsh environments before ever seeing a combat deployment. They willingly served significantly longer operational tours in the combat theater, allowing them to carefully build incredibly deep, highly valuable institutional knowledge. The standard American conscript soldiers typically completed a rigid one-year combat tour and immediately left the harsh country just as they had finally mastered the dense environment. You simply cannot properly teach a frightened teenager the deeply complex, highly nuanced art of silent jungle craft within a single 12-month operational deployment window. The very last highly trained Australian combat troops officially departed from the fractured nation of South Vietnam in 1972. They tragically lost a total of 521 brave men killed in action throughout the lengthy conflict, a number proportionally far fewer than the massive American losses. The legendary Special Air Service Squadron proudly returned home with its terrifying, highly lethal combat reputation permanently enhanced across the global special operations community. They had unequivocally proven that highly complex ideological insurgencies could actually be fought and effectively defeated through superior intelligence, infinite patience, and exceptional fieldcraft. We absolutely did not personally lose the localized war in our specific sector of Vietnam, thoughtfully reflected Sergeant Bob Paddy Condon many decades later. We just simply could not save the entire fractured nation all by ourselves. The incredibly profound tactical lessons harvested directly from that initial, terrifying 48-hour tracking hunt back in February 1966 heavily influenced modern counterinsurgency doctrine for decades. Highly elite British and Australian military forces heavily applied these exact same, deeply patient, intelligence-gathering stealth tactics in numerous later asymmetrical global conflicts. The fundamental principles of specialized deep reconnaissance were entirely validated. The absolute core concept that a modern military must intimately understand its deeply entrenched enemy before attempting to aggressively fight them became universal orthodoxy. The incredibly vital lesson that an army must firmly prioritize precise intelligence gathering over applying blind, overwhelming firepower remains deeply relevant today. Yet, the broader historical lesson, painfully extracted from the dense, bleeding jungles of Southeast Asia, remained incredibly sobering for all modern military commanders. Supreme tactical excellence, perfectly executed on a localized battlefield, simply cannot ever successfully overcome the massive, crushing weight of overarching national strategic incoherence and failing political resolve. The brave Australian operators definitively showed that an entirely different, highly effective method of waging asymmetric warfare was absolutely possible and devastatingly lethal. However, as Sergeant Condon's isolated patrol intimately learned during their grueling hunt, you can perfectly stalk the enemy and strike with devastating precision. You can still tragically watch the entire war slowly slip away, because the true center of gravity was never strictly on the battlefield. The massive rubber trees in Phuoc Tuy still stand quietly today, acting as silent, permanent witnesses to the incredibly brave, invisible phantoms who fundamentally changed tactical warfare forever.